Welcome to another episode of The Watchdog with me, Lowkey, here on Mid-Press. As you know, weekly we are going against the grain, covering stories which are regularly marginalized outside the earshot and the eyesight of the masses. For that reason, we hope that you can support us by sharing, liking, commenting, and subscribing on this video here, but also by supporting us on Patreon as a truly independent means of communication, working and investigating the infrastructures of power in our society. We need all the help and assistance we can get. So we hope you will be able to do that. Now, this week, I am joined by someone who really tells a story of this time. You look at somebody who has had the trajectory as a political career that tells you really how power is shaped in our society. In some ways, people view support for the Palestinian cause as political suicide. And this is something that the guest today has lived in real time. In other ways, people perceive, especially now, support for diplomacy above escalation of war, criticality when looking at NATO as a military alliance. People understand this also as political and even professional suicide. So what we have here is a survivor, a two-time survivor of political and professional suicide, of what is considered that in British society. Today, we are talking about somebody who was formerly a shadow minister in the Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party, somebody who was sacrificed at the altar and of a point of view that became commonsensical within our time. He was one of the earlier victims of the witch hunt, and he is somebody who is still alive and kicking and is part of a conference which I am proud to be part of, which is the No2NATO day, which will be taking place in London after great trials and tribulations. It is a chance to assert a point of view which goes against the received wisdom of today's public sphere and says, actually, we have far more as a society to gain by investment in social good rather than imperialism around the world and domination of other people. We essentially understand NATO as a relic of the Cold War, which has no place today and definitely operates against the interests of the majority of the population in this country. So we are joined today by none other than former Labour MP and Shadow Minister, Chris Williamson. Thank you for joining us, Chris.
Thanks for having me on, comrade.
So to start with, I wanted to ask you if you could just break down for us, what is the reason that the No2NATO conference is taking place now? Why is it needed?
Well, obviously, we've got this war going on, this proxy war, this NATO's proxy war in Ukraine at the moment. And there's a very real fear, I think, that we feel, those of us that are involved in trying to organise this No2NATO, No2War rally, that the political class has taken leave of its senses and are hurtling us towards the possibility of a third world war. And that could have devastating consequences. I mean, we're talking about an existential threat here because this could escalate, literally could escalate into a potential nuclear holocaust. But in addition to that, of course, it's also having a profound impact on the quality of life, the standard of living of people in this country, and indeed across Europe, and really right across the sort of Western world, you might say, because the sanctions which are accompanying the support for the war in Ukraine, the sanctions against Russia, are blowing back and hitting European citizens, hitting US citizens, and certainly hitting people living in this country. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why we're seeing this cost of living crisis, or cost of living catastrophe, as I put it, for people who are on modest and low incomes, who are seeing their fuel bills going through the roof, their food bills increasing rapidly. And obviously, this is something which is going to have a profound effect and will lead to an increase, literally, in mortality rates this winter. I mean, we talk every year about the excess winter deaths, which are associated with cold weather, obviously, accidents on the roads and all that kind of stuff. But many of those deaths, those so-called excess winter deaths, are as a consequence of people living in cold homes. Well, that is going to be magnified, 10, 20-fold by the ballooning energy costs. So there's an existential threat, I think, to the world about the possibility of a third world war. And of course, there's also the impact that it's having on people's quality of life right now. And I just think there's nobody speaking up, really, or nobody in the public realm speaking up. None of the political class are speaking up on this. There seems to be a consensus now in Westminster that this war should be prosecuted. And you've got people like Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, openly talking about the prospect of a war, a direct war between NATO and Russia. Well, that is the Third World War. I mean, some might say we're already in a Third World War with the supply of weapons, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, etc. It's a crazy world at the moment, and given that there is very few voices being raised in the media or in the political sphere, we feel that it's important that we try and raise our voices to try and really bring some sense to the situation, and hopefully bring pressure to bear to ensure that a different path is taken by our political leaders.
I think it's also important to point out that this war, in which Ukraine is essentially being used in this war, according to some estimations, you've seen 6,900 civilians killed in Ukraine. You've seen around 8% of its houses destroyed or damaged. You've seen 50% of its energy infrastructure impacted with power cuts. According to the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, in order to keep its economy afloat, Ukraine requires at least $3 billion per month. You've seen almost 14 million Ukrainians displaced. 8 million of them are in Europe, and 6 million of them are internally displaced. That's around about 40% of Ukraine's population also that will require humanitarian assistance. You've even seen in 2022 the Ukrainian economy contract by 35%, and 60% of Ukrainians are now on the brink of living on less than $5.5 a day. And that's according to the World Bank figures. You've seen 9 million Ukrainians now without electricity and water in very, very, very cold temperatures. And you've seen estimates actually from the US government that around 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers and 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. And that estimate is from the end of last year. So what we're talking about is clearly something which is actually against the interests of all involved. In a way, weapons are being sent by the boatload to Ukraine, all form of weapons that it would take years to train Ukrainian forces to even be able to use. There's reports that coming up are armor-piercing depleted uranium ammunition being sent to Ukraine. We know from Iraq what kind of damage depleted uranium actually does to the populations that it's used around. And now there seems the possibility of F-15 and F-16 fighter jets even being sent to Ukraine. So this is very clear war. You know, we have to remember that since February 2022, you've seen $113 billion in aid sent to Ukraine. and almost a majority of that being specifically allocated for military expenditures. There's 28 different countries in the world transferring weapons to Ukraine. The only ones which are not in Europe, though, are Australia, Canada, and the United States. And so what you have is the establishment of Ukraine as a unregulated space for capital accumulation, but also an unregulated space for the testing of weapons. And so you've seen massive jumps of value in for shares in companies like Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems and others. And on top of that, what you've seen is as Zelensky publicly thanked a US corporate lobby group, companies like BlackRock, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Starlink, which is owned by Elon Musk, of course. And he said clearly everyone can become a big business by investing in Ukraine. This is the application of an economic shock therapy, and also the establishment of lend-lease deals where Ukraine will be paying back huge debts indefinitely, really, to the United States. We also know that the economic ministry, the Ukrainian economic ministry, launched a program called Advantage Ukraine, which made a big deal out of the public-private partnerships, the privatization and private ventures, which can supposedly help to restructure Ukraine. And they have help from US aid-supported project team of investment bankers and researchers in order to pursue this shock therapy, this economic shock therapy. Clearly, the greater social good would be pursued by calling for negotiations and bringing people around the table. And what you've actually seen, as has been admitted by several prominent political figures, that both Britain and the US found ways to scupper potential peace deals that could have been reached at that time. And now we've even seen the Seymour Hersh piece, which I'd be interested to hear about your opinion on, which makes a very interesting claim. Now, Seymour Hersh claims that at the time when NATO carried out an exercise known as Baltops 22, which was the US Navy and others working underwater, that at that time there were remotely controlled explosives that were placed on the Nord Stream pipeline. And according to his anonymous sources, these explosives that were placed there were responsible for the sabotaging of the Nord Stream pipelines. So, Chris, taking all of that into account, we've seen so little interrogation and investigation into who was actually responsible for sabotaging the gas pipelines into Europe. What do you think that says about the extent to which our media is acting lock in step and in concert with NATO and its objectives?
It's been completely captured. I mean, look, the corporate media are essentially stenographers for the war machine, stenographers for NATO. And I mean, people like John Mearsheimer was predicting the catastrophe that would befall Ukraine were it not to embrace neutrality. He said that, the West, the kind of NATO, is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. Even people like Henry Kissinger were saying back in 2014, after the US-backed coup overthrew the democratically elected government in Kiev, that Ukraine's future really lay in being a neutral country, if you like, a bridge between, the East and the West in that sense. And, they've both been proved correct. I mean, what John Mearsheimer said was that, if they continued down the path that they were going, that Ukraine would be wrecked as a country. And so it's proved to be. But well, this war has been planned for a long time. I mean, you go back many years. I mean, things, for example, like the NATO's Bucharest declaration in 2008, where it openly said that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. A very provocative statement to make. I mean, and Russia has said that was a red line from their perspective. And of course, Mikhail Gorbachev was given a solemn pledge by James Baker when they were discussing German reunification, and the pledge was given that the NATO would not extend 1 inch beyond the reunified border of Germany. And yet we've seen 14 additional countries in Eastern Europe added to NATO. I mean, NATO's nearly doubled in size. Why is NATO even still in existence? I mean, NATO was established before the so-called Warsaw Pact came into being. It was established on the pretext of, defending the West from the threat posed. I think it was an imaginary threat, actually, but the threat allegedly posed by the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So why is NATO still in existence, let alone almost double the size? But so there's been these provocations, and if you for example, think about the boot being on the other foot for a moment. Something called the Monroe Doctrine, which has been adopted by the United States for getting on for 200 years, I think now, actually, where they say any kind of interference in their hemisphere will be seen as a hostile act. They would not tolerate any intervention by a Russian-backed military alliance or a Chinese-backed military alliance, setting up bases, bringing into their orbit any country in the Americas, let alone right up to their border in, say, Canada or in Mexico. And then you've got, just before the Russian invasion took place in February last year, there were proposals put on the table by Vladimir Putin, a peace and security proposition, which talked about how we could secure peace in Europe, peace and prosperity and security in Europe. And that entailed NATO pulling back, and it also entailed Ukraine committing to neutrality. Now, I don't see what the problem with that actually is, but of course it doesn't work in the interests of the military-industrial complex. Certainly doesn't work in the US political spheres, sort of thinking about the way the world should be, because they want to maintain this kind of unipolar world, as it were. And so their goal, and they're quite open about this, is to essentially balkanize Russia and then pivot towards China. That proposition was put on the table before, I think it was put on the table around December of 2021 by Putin, was just dismissed out of hand by NATO. Didn't even give it the time of day. There were no discussions. They said they weren't interested in it. You've got people like John Denny, a senior figure in the Atlantic Council, writing in the Wall Street Journal, talking about the strategic case of risking war against Russia. You saw the US Defense Department commissioning the RAND Corporation to do some work in relation to basically extending Russia, overextending Russia. What they want to do is to weaken Russia, as I say, and to ultimately balkanize it, because that would create very rich pickings for US corporations, both in terms of the military-industrial complex, who are making an absolute killing now, literally, as well as financially, as you've pointed out. But there are also many other corporations. I mean, and I think you also touched on the point about the reconstruction after the war that that Zelensky has been talking about. So it's very rich because war is a very kind of profitable proposition, isn't it? And these guys are sociopaths who are pushing us towards the brink of a third world war and potential nuclear annihilation. And that's why it's so important to think that voices are raised in opposition to this, and why platforms like yours are so crucial. And what's encouraging is that more and more people are looking to alternative sources of information, because I think if people are increasingly recognizing that the corporate media is totally biased, is totally one-eyed. I mean, we have the absurd spectacle of a BBC correspondent at a press conference with Zelensky and the Prime Minister, I think it was yesterday, saying, "I'd like to give you a hug," to Vladimir Zelensky. And he said, "Well, yeah, of course you can give me." And he went down
So
It's astonishing.
yeah,
It's astonishing, that we're seeing this sort of thing. Look, the fourth estate is supposed to be there to, hold power to account. And it absolutely is not doing that. What it is doing, it's actually doing the bidding of very powerful forces in society, in the world, and representing them, if you like, against us. It's representing the 1% against the 99%. And that's why, as I say, these alternative voices are so crucially important. And it's really interesting as well that our endeavours to hold this rally have run into, huge obstacles. I mean, the establishment has put down huge obstacles to prevent this rally from taking place. They don't even want us to have a meeting. They don't want us to be able to talk amongst ourselves. They don't want us to be even, the prospect of raising the spectre of an alternative way forward. And that's a very, very worrying trend. It seems, so this very authoritarian, notion which has been embraced by the political class, but and actually reinforced and endorsed by the media. It's quite shocking.
Absolutely, Chris. And there's a few things that I want to address about the things that you've just brought up. So many of us point to the Bucharest conference and the statement in 2008 in which NATO says clearly that Ukraine will join. But another organization which not enough has really been exerted in looking into is the NATO Ukraine Civic League, which was actually established in 2003. And at that time, the Secretary General of NATO, George Robertson, took part in the ceremony to found it. Now, at the beginning, it represented 26 NGOs based in Ukraine. And then later on, it came to represent about 48 different NGOs in Ukraine in 2015. So what you saw was this was the stated purpose of this organization. Increase public engagement and involvement of NGOs in discussing key issues of Ukraine's defense and security, promote active participation of public authorities in activities aimed at informing public on the current status of NATO transformation and Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic course. Raise awareness of the society concerning the collective security system, NATO in particular, and cooperation between Ukraine and the alliance. So this was as early as 2003 that process was being pursued. And you saw the astroturfing of this want to join NATO and this attempt to instill within people the idea that it was absolutely a necessity. And these were sponsored civil society organizations. Now, in addition to that, another point that you made, which I think is really worthy of comment, is you looked at this case of a BBC reporter giving a hug to Zelensky at a conference. Now, some research that I did and that later worked with Alan MacLeod on an article for Mint Press looked at the amount of BBC and other popular media, mainstream media, I should say, employees who either came directly out of NATO and then worked for the BBC, or worked for NATO directly after working for the BBC. So one of the most actual glaring examples of this, though, was the foreign news editor for Sky News, Lorna Ward. Now, she was at the same time as being the foreign news editor for Sky News, a strategic communications advisor to the deputy commander of NATO in Afghanistan, Lieutenant General Adrian Bradshaw. Now, on top of that, you have an example of Mark Lowkey going from being the BBC defense correspondent to a NATO spokesman. You also have Una Legescu, who went from working for the BBC directly to being a NATO spokesperson. You have somebody like Dominic Vaitlis, who worked for the BBC and NATO at the same time. You have someone, Soliman Radamandish, who was a PSYOP specialist at NATO at the same time as working for the BBC World Service. You have someone like Matt Walsdall, who worked for NATO and BBC at the same time. Keith Miles, who was a software developer working for the BBC and NATO at the same time. You have Bojan Lazic, who was a psychological operations specialist at NATO at the same time as working for the BBC. And really, we're just scratching the surface with this. We are very much governed by the security state, but also the means through which we receive information and understand reality. That clearly there is this incestuous revolving door relationship between organizations like NATO and the main places that we understand the world through, which is the BBC. Now, as far as I am concerned, Britain, which is currently the 5th largest economy in the world, but is due to fall to the 11th largest economy in the world, has absolutely no interest in picking fights, not only with countries as large and as powerful as Russia, but even more so, has absolutely no interest in joining a fight against the country which is projected to be the world's #1 economy within the next few years, which is China. And actually, what we've seen is, as a result of this war, the United States has consolidated its power within Europe, but it's lost much of the rest of the world. Even the Gulf, you have not seen governments there who historically have a very good relationship with the United States, who are home to US military bases galore, have not taken the US and NATO side of this question. And actually, moreover, what you've seen is the beginning of the end for the dollar. So much in the same way that British exertion over the Suez Canal in Egypt spelt the end of supremacy for the pound sterling, we are seeing the war in Ukraine spell the end for the dominance of the US dollar, with even countries like China and Saudi Arabia trading no longer in the dollar, and China, India, Russia trading with each other in currencies other than the dollar. What do you have to say about that move? And also, from my perspective as a participant in the No2NATO conference, I would absolutely state very clearly that it is against Britain's national interest to be involved in this process. And it's certainly against the interest of everyday people in this country to be pouring all of this energy, resource, and weaponry into a place where what should be the alternative is diplomacy, and bring people around the table and find a negotiated peace. What would you say, Chris, is the thrusting force but behind holding this conference?
Well, I mean, look, the globalization agenda, the US empire, I think, has shot itself in the foot with the positions that it's taken in relation to, picking this fight with Russia, provoking this war in Ukraine. Because, as you say, I mean, it's having a profound effect on the dollar. I mean, the petrodollar, is losing its dominant position now. And when you think that it's argued that the war in Iraq was linked to the Iraqi oil being traded in the euro. The intervention in Libya, because Gaddafi was talking about a Pan-African currency and trading there, and that again threatened the dominance of the petrodollar. But they've kind of done it to themselves. They've forced a situation upon them, which is actually not going to work in the interests of these elites. But that won't necessarily be detrimental actually to the vast majority of ordinary US citizens, because ordinary US citizens haven't benefited from the unipolar position of the United States. I mean, real wages in the US haven't increased for the best part of 40 years, in fact. And therefore, a retrenchment in that sense would actually, and a more of a focus, if you like, on the internal US economy will, in my opinion, benefit ordinary working class people in the United States. Whilst it might be to the detriment of the elites. But when we say about the detriment, I mean, how much of a detriment is it? I mean, these people are still going to be super wealthy, so it's not going to be, they're not exactly going to be in penury in that sense. So yes, I mean, I think they've played this incredibly badly. It seems to me, united the world really, against the kind of the Western powers. All the efforts that the sanctions that they imposed on Russia were supposed to collapse the Russian economy, and kicking them out of the SWIFT banking system was supposed to destroy their economy. Of course, it did no such thing. It was going to tank allegedly, the ruble, the Russian currency, and I saw some reports relatively recently which suggested that the Russian ruble was the strongest currency in the world. So it hasn't. I mean, all the effects that they claimed would happen haven't worked, and it seems to me they're getting increasingly desperate. And what's really depressing, actually, is the fact that there are no, sane voices coming out of the political class, certainly in this country. One or two maybe in the States who are speaking out, but very, very few and far between. But I don't detect any voice of reason in the House of Commons. Maybe Jeremy Corbyn, put him to one side, but from the main parties, I mean, even John McDonnell was on Peston this week, saying that the path to peace was to arm Ukraine to secure its borders. It's kind of unbelievable that the entire political class is totally on board with this trajectory that we're on to all-out confrontation with NATO. What that's going to happen? What does that mean then for ordinary British citizens? It's really frightening.
And just before we wrap up, unfortunately, Chris, we are almost out of time. I think it's important that people actually understand that NATO is not some sort of charity. Strangely, I think through this media infrastructure and this public sphere so dominated by either former or current NATO employees, you have this impression that NATO bombed Libya 7,700 times in 7 months, completely eviscerated the country. NATO had a 20-year war in Afghanistan that led to 250,000 people dying and tens of millions of people being displaced. This is the business of war, and that is NATO's function in the world. We need to reintroduce a serious critical education about NATO and its activities in this country so that people can actually really understand reality as it is, not how powerful people might wish they saw it. So, absolutely. Chris, just to wrap up, if you can just tell us when the No2NATO conference will be and how people can keep in touch and get involved.
Well, just on your final point, very, very briefly, but that's why Julian Assange is languishing in Belmarsh prison, and why the US are determined to extradite him and sentence him to 175 years imprisonment, basically, obviously the rest of his life. But the No2NATO No to War rally will go ahead despite the efforts of the establishment to cancel us. We've had 2 cancellations. The St Pancras Church cancelled us, and then Conway Hall, with its reputation for hosting radical progressive socialist events, nearly 100 years. Jeremy Corbyn's parents met there. Even they cancelled us. But we do have a venue which we're not announcing until the last moment. It's going to take place on the 25th of February in central London, not that far from Euston Station. It will be an all-day event, and we welcome people there. And it's really important that we come together to say this is not being done in our name. And what we're hoping from this rally is that we will be able to launch an ongoing campaign and an ongoing international campaign. We've already made links with an equivalent organization in the US, and we are hoping to make links as well, and we've made some links already with like-minded people, and there are many of them on the continent of Europe. And I think it's really important that ultimately what we want to do is create a worldwide movement that says no to NATO, because its time is up and it should be disbanded.
Absolutely. Chris Williamson, thank you so much for joining us. Keep on, keep resisting. All the best.